So first of all, welcome everyone. We are delighted you're here. We are very excited today to launch the Playbook, and we're excited to launch it with you. To kick us off this morning, I'm going to hand over to my colleague and a fellow co-lead on this project who's been incredible to work with on all of this, Andy Korobos. Andy, please take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy. I'm the CEO of Elektra Labs, and I'm one of the working group members who built this resource for you to get to check out. And so what I'll do today is I'm going to talk to you about digital clinical measures and what they are and remote monitoring. Then I'm going to tell you more about the working group and how we all came together to work on this. I will tell you more about what is in the playbook. And then this is a first unveiling. We wanted to not just give you a concept, but something to react to. And the goal here is that you join and help us build out this resource for more and more people to be able to successfully use remote monitoring in practice. So the reason why we all came together is there's something really interesting and special about using connected sensors. I think many people on this call are using them across public health, clinical trials, and care. And when you collect data right now in a hospital or at a site, you're only collecting episodic data. But there's a lot more opportunity to collect this more continuous data and really understand the lived experience of a person. But how do we do this safely and effectively and know that the data that we're collecting is actually clinically meaningful? So this group in particular came together because lots of people are working on that, often in silos more so. So there's a group within clinical trials, there's a group within care, there's people looking at this in public health. But if you think about this as a person, a heartbeat's a heartbeat. We don't have Pfizer heartbeat and Novartis heartbeat and Mayo Clinic heartbeats. We have heartbeats that are human heartbeats. And so as we think about how do we collect these sorts of measures, how do we think about sleep, we think the way that we should approach these should be similar across contexts. And we wanted to create a unified resource so that we could build this industry together, everybody on this call, in a more intentional and cohesive fashion. There's a ton of reasons why we want to do this now. There is a lot of opportunity where consumer, quote unquote, and clinical technologies are overlapping. People might have seen the Apple announcement yesterday. Many of the top tech companies now have clearances from regulatory agencies. Fitbits came out yesterday. Clinical trials have been struggling to recruit in many instances, and there's a lot of opportunities where decentralized trial formats where you're collecting these sorts of data at home can be more inclusive and increase patient or decrease patient burden. And similar across clinical care, figuring out how we can create better early morning systems that are more patient-centered. And this, although this work technically started before COVID, COVID has been a massive accelerant as things have shifted from the site and from the hospital to home. And if anyone saw the Stat News announcement this morning, they released a really wonderful remote monitoring report. So this is like top of mind for everyone. I think many people are excited about it, but how do we do it? How do we actually get this into practice? So before we go, I'm curious who everybody is and how you are trying to get it into practice today. So we're going to release a poll, get ready to use Zoom, and we are going to ask you, what is your primary focus where you work on digital clinical measures, or interested if you don't do it yet? Jen, will you be able to release the results?
I will. I'm going to give it just a hot second for
okay.
a few final votes.
Great. So I don't know if everyone can see this. So right now on the call, we have 67% of people in clinical trials, clinical care, and public health. This makes a ton of sense. I think as you look at the industry, clinical trials has adopted a lot of these digital measures sooner than care has recently, and we can talk more about why that has happened. But each of these things start coming together in cohesive fashion. And so we want to make sure that people have the opportunities to learn from one another and that we're moving as a cohesive collective force. So our goal here is to build a shared foundation. We don't want to have different regulatory policies necessarily. There might be some reasons why some things that are different, but the foundation across this should be the same. A heartbeat's a heartbeat. And so this is how this group came together. A number of people were working on trials across care, across public health, and we realized that this is something that we need to work on as a group. And so you'll get to hear today, we're not going to have everybody introduce themselves. directly. We're going to have them introduce it in a show don't tell format. So people will show how they're using the playbook today. They're going to show you components of the playbook. And the goal here is to use this first version and then join this next tour of duty to work on this. Part of the reason why we thought about this as a quote tour of duty is that this is an element of service. And that similar to how other groups might come together for short periods of time, we wanted to come together over 4 to 6 months. The next one will be about 4 to 6 months to put together another resource and make sure that we're moving fast enough along with how quickly these technologies are moving. Another thing that's important is that our goal as the working group was not to create new material. Our goal was to cite established work and to bring together the many disparate sources into one uniform guide. So that means the most recent regulatory policies, that meant the most innovative work across the security research community, across many different groups. And so what you're seeing on this slide is these are not organizations that necessarily endorse the playbook, but have been cited through the playbook. And we highlight, as you see when you go into the playbook, we won't recreate the work that people have done. We will highlight the main sources, and then you will be able to click through to the original source that people have worked on. The second thing that's really important is that public resources are one place, but many of this has still been undefined. And so there's a lot of groups that are coming together that are creating spaces to collaborate. And so what we're doing with the playbook is we want to create a grounding and a guide so that those spaces to collaborate have a foundation that they can continue to build. We know everything that we're working on is a living document. Okay, so some Zoom and housekeeping. We would love for you to use the Q&A function. We may or may not be able to get to everybody. Many of the people here are also on Twitter, so you're welcome to DM people directly if they have their DMs open. We will be managing the Q&A at the end, and then Jen will take us off to talk through the playbook itself. All right, Jen,
Fantastic.
off to you.
Thanks, Andy. And I will just start sharing my screen. Andy, give me the nod when you can see that.
Can see it.
Fantastic. Well, welcome again, everyone. And I wanted to very quickly introduce the Digital Medicine Society, not because this is all of our work, but because it's an honor to host the Playbook Working Group today, and also everyone on the line. So the most important thing is to say thank you again for joining us. And I wanted to give you some background on who we are. So the Digital Medicine Society, we are a professional society of passionate individuals who are committed to advancing digital medicine to optimize health. And specifically, we think about advancing the safe, effective, ethical, and equitable use of these digital medicine products in the service of health. We do this through a variety of different ways. Let me go back a second, sorry. We do this through a variety of different ways. We do it through a broad research portfolio. We do it through a thriving sort of program of communication and education activities, and also community building. And I'm really proud of our participation in the Playbook because I think it draws on elements of all of those things to achieve our common mission. We launched in May of last year, and we have had, I'm very proud to say, extraordinary success since then. And I think it's because of our commitment to sitting and placing the society at the intersection of two communities, between healthcare and technology. We recognize the critical importance of having everyone at the table to really think critically about advancing this field and doing it in a way that truly is improving access to healthcare, for example, rather than potentially increasing disparities, that's taking advantage of digital technologies to do things like precision medicine as opposed to doubling down on the surveillance economy. We really think about using these tools and working together for the betterment of society and for every individual's lives. And I think that the timing of our launch was really important. People are ready to come together, and I can't think of a better example of what can happen and what can be achieved when this collaboration happens than the Playbook. So with that in mind, let me guide, I want to sort of spend a couple of minutes just talking about what we have on deck here in the Playbook. Our goal was to provide you with a comprehensive resource that you can start using with your teams today as you develop and as you deploy digital clinical measures across a variety of different settings: clinical research, clinical care, and public health. And what's important is The working group and all of my colleagues on the line, who I'll introduce in a moment, are absolutely extraordinary. They were able to bring different perspectives. They were able to force a line of thinking. They were able to develop this resource for you, but we don't see this as the finished product. Oh, I'm missing a slide. We don't see this just yet as the finished product. We do see this as an opportunity for you to help us. Everyone on the line, I think, has a role to play in continuing to advance this resource. So we are delighted you are here today. And I am just going to quickly highlight how we're going to use our time this morning before introducing my colleagues. So importantly, why are we all here? Why are we excited about digital clinical measures? We'll start our conversation by reflecting on the role that remote monitoring can play across these different settings to optimize health. We're going to introduce you to the Playbook. This is a living resource. We want you to be able to start using it immediately. And so we'll introduce it to you and cover how you can start accessing it now to deploy with your teams and in your work today. We'll think about how we can use different elements of the Playbook to improve lives in different settings. We'll offer an overview of how each of you on the line can get involved. As Andy said, please use the Q&A function to pose your questions to all of the experts on the line this morning. And then we will round out with next steps, not just for this working group, but for the project writ large. And with that, we'll start with the case for digital measures. I'm going to do this by introducing you to some of my colleagues to describe first the need for high quality digital measures. And two, I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to tell us a little bit about why they participated in the Playbook. And Gina, I'm going to ask you to kick us off, to introduce yourself to everyone on the line and why you are so excited to dive in with us on the Playbook. Oh, Gina, I'm so sorry. I don't know if you're on mute or if your mic has given you difficulties.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Excellent. It is being finicky this morning, but thanks so much, Jen. I'm really excited to be a part of this group and to be sharing with all of you this morning in the launch of the Playbook. My name is Gina Vallow. I am a Presidential Innovation Fellow.
Gina, I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm so sorry. We lost you for a second there.
Jen, I'm gonna go ahead and dial in from my phone. If you want to skip past me, we can come back.
Happy to.
Thank you.
I'm going to move across. Priyanka, I'm going to call on you if I can to introduce yourself to everyone on the line and tell us about why you're passionate about sort of increasing remote monitoring in the work you do and why the Playbook was important to you.
Yeah, absolutely, Jen, and thank you to you and Andy for assembling this great group. So to briefly introduce myself, I work at Myokardia, which is a small precision medicine biotechnology company, and we're focused on cardiomyopathies. And I joined the company to really build out our digital health program, and there's so many opportunities to use technology to improve care for patients, for clinical trials. And I come to this work having been a physician, and where I continue to practice at UCSF. And at UCSF, I led our telehealth initiatives and was involved in a number of technology-facing efforts. And so, you know, I met Andy earlier this year, and she and I were discussing how important this work is, and yet how so many people don't know how to get started. People don't know how to talk with the FDA. And really, there needs to be a community of people that are really motivated to lift up the whole community. I think this is beyond any one pharma company, any one health system. This is really, I think, a movement that needs to start. We all should work together. I think so many of us are so passionate about how we can improve care for patients and for people by doing this type of work. And we're still in such early days, and I think there's so much that can be done. And I'm just really looking forward to collaborating with everybody who's here today.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Priyanka. Do you want to touch for a second on the case example that you brought to the table and that we thread through the Playbook? I think it's such a great example, and folks may enjoy hearing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the areas that Myokardia is focused on is the treatment of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is the most common inherited cardiomyopathy. And it's a terrible disease in which, you often hear about it when an athlete suddenly dies. And so Myokardia is developing what will be the first targeted therapy for this disease space. And we just recently released our phase 3 study results, which were really wonderful. And one of the things we were really interested in understanding is with the drug that we've developed, what sort of improvements do we see that are truly patient-facing? I think so often clinical trials, you're focused on really technical and scientific parameters that can be hard for patients to understand. So one of the things that we're doing is in almost every one of our trials in this space, we're measuring how our therapy affects overall activity for patients, with the idea being that this is something that is truly patient-facing. It's meeting patients in their daily lives, and we really want to understand with a beneficial therapy what happens with individuals' overall activity. And so we have incorporated actigraph accelerometers in a number of these studies, and we're just now in the process of analyzing some of the results that we're getting. And some of the challenges that we have here are that you don't really have great benchmarks for what activity looks like in this patient population, or even in general. So if you tell me that you've walked 4,000 versus 5,000 steps, I have a sense that, okay, there might be something different and something meaningful about those changes, but we don't have a great sense of what normal looks like across different patient populations. And so that's an area where I feel like the research community could really come together and say, okay, what are studies that we can do to establish normal benchmarks for these patient populations? And then alongside, one of the questions that we've had is, how do we move beyond accelerometry being largely an exploratory endpoint to something that can truly end up on a label for a therapy that can be a secondary endpoint or even a primary endpoint? And to me, it feels like we really do need to come together with other sponsors, other clinicians, and the FDA to understand, well, what are the steps we need for us to move beyond this being something that feels really meaningful and very patient-centric and very patient-facing to something that we can truly use with the same rigor as any one of our other clinical parameters.
Fantastic. Thanks, Priyanka. And I really like how you sort of explained your use case for the Playbook today. And we are grateful that you are able to sort of articulate that and use it as a guide for folks who might be using the Playbook later. Gina, I'm going to come back to you if I can. I think we've got you back on mic. Let me know.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thanks, Gina.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks for your patience. I'll just start from the beginning again. I'm Gina Vallow. I'm a Presidential Innovation Fellow at FDA. I work in the office of Dr. Amy Abernethy, the Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer. And it's been a fascinating, interesting time lately, and particularly in the world of real-world evidence and real-world data. And one of the things that is really exciting to me about this playbook is the opportunity to really start getting folks in this community on the same page about measures and data and what's needed to make meaning out of all of this important work. We have, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, a very large number of very urgent and immediate questions that we need to answer. And while we typically prefer scientific experiments like randomized controlled trials, we think these are the best way to generate scientific evidence, we don't always have the luxury of time, and we don't necessarily have enough capacity to run these experiments in a meaningful way, particularly in the context of a global pandemic. So we have to get pretty creative, especially right now, about using the data that are available to us. And in many cases, this is EHR and claims data, which we're all familiar with, but we're also looking towards social media data, sensors and wearables, and really anything that might give us insight into patient activities and outcomes. And we really need to start to understand when this type of data is really reliable and usable, and when instead we need to rely on some of the more scientific methods like clinical trials. What we've been doing is working closely with a number of public-private partnerships. One in particular, the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA has created the Evidence Accelerator model at our request to help start addressing critical questions relevant to COVID-19 using real-world data, things like natural history of COVID-19, patterns of treatments, and also how we think about the role of diagnostics, which is where I've personally been very involved. And then we're also working with more of my colleagues in the Center for Devices, but myself as well have been involved with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, which is another public-private partnership focused on preparing manufacturers of COVID-19 diagnostics to use real-world data in their 510(k) submissions. So a lot of really exciting work happening, really interested and excited to see how this playbook can drive more collaboration and agreement around how to capture this data, how to think about this data and use this data. And the more we're on the same page, the faster we'll move together. So I'm very excited to be a part of it again. And thank you, Jen. I'll turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gina. And I think that's a great example of sort of work done, as you said, under time pressure to make this work today. And again, another goal of the playbook to try and support that. As I move ahead, Lara, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to everyone on the line and talk a little bit about sort of your passion for some of the contents of the playbook and why you think digital measures are important. Quick note to everyone on the line, which I didn't say and I apologize. The slides that we're sharing here are some samples from the playbook, just to start to introduce you to some of the different work and resources we make available. So quick note on that. And Lara, please introduce yourself to everyone and dive in on benchmarking.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm Lara Mangraviti. I'm the president at Sage Bionetworks. We're a nonprofit biomedical research organization, and we're focused on practices that help establish reliable scientific outcomes. And so I am so thrilled to be a part of the development of the playbook because it provides guidelines to the many researchers across the field who are looking to bring digital measures into their work. They're looking to innovate in this way, but we often find that researchers aren't exactly sure how to get started, and they're not sure exactly what all the steps are, what all the considerations are they need to take to actually make sure they get meaningful, and reliable outcomes from the work they're doing. And so to have it all sort of laid out for you in one place allows us to have a common language about what each of those pieces are, and to start to talk through that, I think, across the industry. And I think that that's just amazingly helpful, not just for each individual, but for the field in general. So I'm going to highlight one of the sections of the playbook for you, and that is around benchmarking, which is a topic which is near and dear to my heart, and something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. So there's a variety of instances where you might be wanting to pick a digital measure, but there are some challenges either around data collection or data analysis that make it hard to decide to make that choice. And so benchmarking is really an open and collaborative approach for independent validation of measures. And I'll give you a little example. So we're particularly interested in my work on benchmarking of methods that require machine learning algorithms on sensor data. So if you think about the field of cognition, right, the sort of standard approach to evaluating cognition in the clinic is a series of tasks, often paper-based tasks, such as giving a patient the time and asking them to draw a clock for that time. There are really innovative ways that people are thinking of measuring cognition using sensors that allow us to move beyond that. So we can use digital measures actually to perform that same clock assessment, right? And that gives us a richer set of information. But we can also move beyond that to think about the cognitive tasks that we do in our everyday lives, the cognitive tasks that actually are are the features, the functions that a patient likes to be able to do, right? The things that they care about. Things like being able to drive a car or have a conversation on the phone with another individual. And if we can start to measure those sorts of things, we might get closer to a real meaningful outcome for patients themselves. But in order to do that, we're going to start to bring in complex, right, machine learning approaches, and we may come up with outcomes that both don't match to the existing clinical outcomes, but also may not even be human interpretable. So how do we go about as a community evaluating the validity of these measures and understanding where it's best to use them? And so benchmarking is one way we can do that. And so we talk about it a little bit in the playbook. Thanks, Jen.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lara. And I'm going to move on to the last member of our team I'm going to introduce in this section. Katie, would you mind introducing yourself and the new center at Scripps to everyone on the line and telling us about why you were so excited to participate in co-creating the playbook?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
I'm having technical difficulties this morning. So I'm Katie Bacamotz. I am the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at Scripps Research, and I am helping launch and develop the Scripps Research Digital Trial Center, which is a collaboration between Scripps Research Translational Institute and Care Evolution, our technology partner. So we were super excited and honored to be a part of the playbook. We have been working on decentralized clinical trials, as the teams have discussed, and really incorporating wearables and sensor technology into clinical research for many, many years now. My colleagues, Dr. Steinhubel and Ed Ramos, will talk about it a little bit in the next section about some of the projects that we're doing that utilize the playbook. But we wanted to be able to take some of those early learnings from the trials that we've run, you know, mistakes and challenges that we've had in the past, and be able to, in a small way, contribute to, you know, putting together the playbook to help others and really advance the science. So I think when Jen and Andy, you guys reached out to us initially, and, you know, Andy, I keep coming back to this, the heartbeat is a heartbeat. Our most recent study that we're conducting, DETECT, is a COVID and other influenza-like illness study, but we're looking at measuring resting heart rate variability, sleep, activity out in the wild. And to open that up to a general population in the way that we do, and we get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to participate, it's much easier if we can be platform agnostic, device agnostic, and that all, you know, it doesn't matter if you're measuring your heart rate on a Fitbit or a Withing or Garmin. So having those standards and really coming together collectively as an industry to advance those is going to be really helpful going forward with those types of studies. The other thing that I mentioned here, and I'm showing a slide here for the playbook of what I like to use from an operational standpoint. You know, we all have our ideas of how this should work, but I think, Andy, you mentioned in the playbook, it's kind of like the checklist manifesto, right? So from a behavioral standpoint, those things are very simple once you see them in practice, right? But if you don't have those things and you don't have a standard framework and a checklist that you follow, it can you know, have problems, you know, going forward. So for this, I mean, even as simple as what Laura was just mentioning, of making sure when we approach a problem, a project, thinking about the measures that we want, right? What is it that we're measuring? What is the problem? What is meaningful to both the participant, the patient, or the clinician, instead of chasing, you know, the technology first. Hey, we've got this technology that can do these things. Let's start with that. No, we need to start with the measures first, then the technologies, and then the operations. For me, I find just having those frameworks laid out in a playbook so that everybody's speaking the same language and going back to the same process has been really helpful for us at Scripps at the Digital Trial Center, something that we're already putting in place. So we're super excited to be here and collaborate and continue to see how the playbook will advance over time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katie. And just to orient folks on the line, we'll do a very brief, I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to do a brief Q&A with my colleagues from the Playbook who just presented in that session before I hand back to Andy, who will introduce you formally to the Playbook. So one of the things that I love about our work here at DIME, and it's reflected in the Playbook, is that we are always ambitious when we embark on these sorts of projects. And so we set out not just to think about the use of these digital clinical measures in a single setting or context of use, but thinking that, you know, data isn't stored in manila folders anymore in a file cabinet. They are more broadly accessible. We should be able to reference them across the broad sort of range of public health, real world evidence. Gina, you gave us some great examples of that, of clinical research and clinical care, and the lovely sort of saying a heartbeat's a heartbeat. I was hopeful that we would find a broad shared foundation around developing and sort of deploying these measures. But when we look at the playbook, probably more than half the work that goes into developing a clinical measure is the same, regardless of context. And so I'd love to hear from you guys. Were you surprised in the same way, or did you have any other sort of thoughts that changed during the course of compiling the playbook? And Gina, maybe I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I mean, I think in the involvement I've had in the playbook, my experience has been that there's quite a bit here that, and I think as the sort of the playbook ever expanded, which we saw in the process of sort of realizing just how much we need to define to get everyone on the same page. And I think for me personally, you know, part of this was coming at this from the angle of a fresh set of eyes and looking at it as someone without a medical background. Can I understand these concepts and make sense of them? And I, you know, my feeling on this is that the more descriptive we can be and the more detailed we can be, and particularly I think the order of operations really stuck out to me as a critical point. And the more on the same page we are, the more effective we will be as a research community.
Fantastic. Katie, you touch a lot of different worlds in your work, a lot of different settings for using these measures. What surprised you in compiling the playbook?
So I think what was nice and interesting as I was going through the playbook, you know, as it, again, like Gina said, is ever expanding, is just the amount of resources that are already out there that are open source, that are so valuable that the teams have put together. And so I kept, you know, bookmarking things and clicking on things, and I'm like, oh yeah, we can use that. And there was an automatic, I think, use case for a lot of it. So having it in one area and just understanding the information that has already been compiled and the best practices that are already out there were really surprising in a fantastic way.
Fantastic. And just building on that quickly before we wrap up this discussion, I think we've all come to love our sort of tagline, a heartbeat is a heartbeat. And I think after this, we all feel strongly there shouldn't be a Pfizer heartbeat, a Takeda heartbeat, a Kaiser heartbeat, a Mayo heartbeat, a Apple heartbeat, a Fitbit heartbeat, the list goes on, CDC heartbeat. We've tried to write that up in the playbook. How do we actually start to apply that? How do we actually start to sort of advance the spirit of collaboration, of a shared vision around what a measure should be and how we develop it and how do we deploy this? How do we keep advancing all of the principles that we outline here in the playbook? And Lara, I see you nodding, so I may come to you first.
Sure, ask me the big hard question. Well, I mean, I think, and I swear Jen didn't just stick me in here purposely on this, but I think the work that Dime is doing actually helps a lot here, right? Thinking about standards and organizing the community around what the key components are that need to be coming out of each of these, you know, measures that is measuring heartbeat, and then honestly bringing the FDA in as well. So this is going to have to be a collaborative effort that we all agree on, and we're going to need to just set the standards, and then everyone who comes after will follow.
I think those are really important remarks, and I don't think for a second the playbook would be as valuable as it is if we hadn't have had this diverse participation in the drafting, and that's why we're so excited to have everyone on the line to help us continue to create it. Priyanka, I might just pose that question in a similar fashion to you. You obviously work in medical product development. You also continue to treat patients at UCSF. How do you see the crosswalk across these different settings as we develop these high quality, trusted digital measures?
Yeah, I think the key is really collaborating with different groups. So, you know, we have a perspective at Myokardia in clinical trials and in cardiovascular disease, but you know, UCSF and health systems have their own research perspective. I think other sponsors who may be in other disease areas, and, you know, we care about activity in cardiovascular disease, but we care about it in Parkinson's, we care about it across different diseases. So I think that the more that these disparate groups can talk to each other, the more useful it's going to be, because so often, you know, we look to see, okay, well, what is the other research with activity in cardiovascular disease? But we really have to think beyond those silos and look at really what is the entire field doing, what is the academic world. And, you know, I also talked about just with the idea around benchmarking, you know, is there a role for really collaborating with groups like the NIH who could even fund this type of work? Because I truly feel like understanding these benchmarks is a community good, and it's something that is hard for a sponsor to take on. And I'd love to see more sponsored research so that we can really feel more confident in the research that we're doing, in the data that we're collecting. And, you know, I think this work it's a huge body of work because, you know, I think heartbeat is probably a couple of steps ahead because, you know, I think we all understand the meaning of a heartbeat and what's normal and what's abnormal. When you're looking at measures like activity, we're truly so early in this process because we don't have a great way of saying what's normal activity, what's abnormal activity, how should we measure activity? Is steps the best way? Should we go to the more pre-processed raw form? And so I think that there really has to be a very concerted effort place to really understand. And it feels like thus far what we've been getting are isolated studies that get published, but there's not really been coordination and a strategy around, okay, well, who can take on which pieces of the work so that we truly feel confident in collecting this data and understanding what it means.
Fantastic. Thanks, Priyanka. And thank you. Gina, did you want to hop in on that?
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to say, I mean, I think one of the things we've been learning in the evidence accelerator work as well is that you learn as much about what doesn't work when you try to standardize and create definitions as when you find things that do work. And so when I think about this playbook as a public good and an open source solution, I think about how important it is that feedback make it back into the playbook so that when these principles and this is being used as a tool and we find places that it doesn't quite work and we need to deviate from it, how does that make it back into the community resource where we start to deviate in the same ways and learn from the edge cases that each organization might be finding, because that is how we make this stronger and we continue to feed it and stay on the same page and avoid that Takeda heartbeat versus a Pfizer heartbeat versus a NIH heartbeat. And I think that feedback loop and that commitment is like any public good. If we feed it and we all take care of it, it will grow along with us.
Gina, I hadn't used that term yet, so I'm officially telling everyone when I start describing this as a public good, it came from Gina. Gina, Katie, Lara, Priyanka, thank you for being such important members of the working group and for giving us some fantastic teasers on the playbook this morning. Andy, I'm going to hand back to you to walk through a couple of slides from the playbook and to let folks on the line know how they can dive in later today and start using this public good. And if you want to grab screen sharing, you should be able to take it.
Perfect. And if you all see me typing, I am answering questions as people go. Also, some of the participants will be answering those, and we're using the Q&A function, not the chat. So bring that up. Okay, so we keep saying like this playbook, like what is this thing, right? Let's share screen. So first of all, we did Inception. So everything you've been seeing so far is playbook slides. And people asked us, are we sharing the slides later? The answer is technically yes, because all of this is coming out in the playbook that is will be launched at the end of this meeting. So you'll be able to check it out. Okay, so what is this thing? This, again, Jen had shared this slide. We have a couple philosophies of how we wanted to build this. And first is really thinking about making sure that this is centered around patients, right? And the way that you center this around patients, participants, and people, in the case of perhaps public health where someone might not be a patient yet, is really focusing on determining what measures matter. And so everything here is around the measure first, and then technologies come second, and then making sure you can deploy that comes third. The order really matters. If you buy a bunch of technologies and deploy them and then the Bluetooth doesn't work, that's a real big pain. If you are really obsessed with one technology but it doesn't measure what you need, that's not going to be helpful. So we really want to focus on measures. And we are not technologist absolutists. Like, we don't think that tech is the only solution. Tech is one type of solution. And if you choose to use that solution, this is what a resource that can be useful. So as you see, we have half on the foundation, and then we split out because there will be differences across research, care, and public health. We hope not too much in the measure itself, but there might be certain compliance or audit or reimbursement considerations or operational considerations that you'll need. So this is a content slide. The playbook is 404 pages, which is quite a monster, but we are very excited about it, and you can dive in based on where you need. So we have subsections, and certain groups probably won't need certain other pieces. So you don't, this is kind of like a choose your own adventure. If you're from the Goosebumps era, this is where you can go through and find what you want. And you'll see that there's a whole chunk on measures, tech, and ops, and you'll get to see this from our teammates. And then we have a section on ethics. We have a section on benchmarking. We have sections on regulatory and policy and how you can build the future of these tools and also of standards. And then we customize. So I'm going to show you a couple slides. We always want to start with stories and make sure that you are using this and finding somebody who is similar to you and how you put these in practice. We know that the readers of these tools are people who are deploying and using them in practice. And there are many different types of, quote, users, right? There's people who are developing the systems, there's patients who are using it. And so we have different groups that you can look at. We have a couple different slides. So we have standard slides that show, you know, why you might work on these tools and highlight different more traditional types of slides. But then we also have 3 special kinds of slides. So one is pro tips, which is the plain language that you wish somebody had explained to you when you're reading something like a regulatory doc. We have spotlight slides. Again, from the beginning, we are not trying to create new material. We are trying to stitch together material. So there's lots of spotlight slides that will show you the original content that you should go into. Somebody asked us around regulatory. You should always read the actual regulatory docs. And don't be afraid of them, even if you're not a lawyer. It is good when someone says, quote, this agency can't do it, say, where's the reg? And then also check with your lawyer. And we also have worksheets. We wanted to make sure that this is practical and not something that is just like philosophical for you to actually use and print out and use with your team. Okay, so example. So pro tip, we do not use the word device. This is an example of one. And the reason why we do that is device is a term of art with many different types of regulators, and we will use a more specific term like sensor, biometric monitoring technology, wearable algorithm. And so we're very intentional with the type of language. There's a lot more in here as to like when something is a device and when it is not a device. And this is something that we are very thoughtful about, and you'll see things like pro tips to help you get through them. Second are spotlight slides. So we'll link to exact resources. This is an example of one that recently came out from the Duke Margolis Center that had really interesting and thoughtful construction around what are different types of endpoints and how might they be used in real life and real world settings. And so we'll point back to these different types of tools. And then we'll get more into this, but these are the types of ways that you can move from a meaningful aspect of health, concept of interest, and clinical measure. I'll jump through this because you'll see this more in practice, but you'll get to fill in and use these sorts of tools for yourself. So Jen, do you want to share back with teammates so people can see it in practice?
I would love to. Let me just share my screen. I think I'm in a good spot here. There we go. Can you see my slides up?
Yes.
Fantastic. So now we've sort of met the playbook a little bit more, I want to introduce the rest of our colleagues who co-created this first draft and ask each of them to sort of tell us why they're excited about the playbook launching today, and specifically how they plan to use different elements of the team of the playbook in their work starting today with their teams and on their projects. So Christine, I wonder if you would mind going first, introducing yourself and letting us know how you plan to use the playbook.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So hi, I'm Christine Manta. I lead the research team at Elektra Labs, where we're building a platform to guide measurement selection and connected sensor evaluation for deployment in research and care. So one of the key messages of the playbook that we also follow at Elektra is that order matters. So by following this optimal flow that we've mentioned a couple of times now of measures, technologies, operations, you'll ensure a patient-focused and an efficient process that yields high-quality, meaningful data. So I truly believe that the playbook sets the foundation to drive the digital medicine field towards reaching its full potential of impacting meaningful change in a person's lived experience with a disease. So the playbook starts with a focus on measures. Patient engagement early and often throughout this measurement selection process will enable your teams to clearly and specifically identify what outcome to collect. Myself, Jen Goldsack, excuse me, and Bray Patrick Lake of Evidation co-authored the peer-reviewed piece that the playbook references that describes how we define what meaningful aspect of health means, what a concept of interest means, and what the outcomes to be measured could be. This piece was just published in Digital Biomarkers this morning, so I'm really excited that it made it in to be a reference and for researchers and clinical teams to check that out in the measurement section. So then once your measurement is selected, you can move to evaluating technologies. So questions like what's the best drug or what's the best food, those need context in order to give an appropriate answer. Same with asking what's the best heart rate monitor or what's the best activity tracker. Knowing the answers to those questions really requires knowing the context of use. So the playbook presents an evaluation framework for technologies that considers validation, utility and usability, security, and data rights metrics. And this framework is very practical. It's ready to be adopted by your organization, and then it's able to be adapted for the unique needs of your own group. And I'll hand it back over to Jen.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. I really like how you were able to sort of take us through the measures. I think the example of, you wouldn't just recommend a diet to someone without having some context, it all applies so well here. And also the plug for the playbook containing the most recent scholarship on all of this, hot off the presses this morning. With that, Chris, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to everyone on the line and talking maybe a little bit more about the operations piece of all this. You run a really important organization sort of delivering measures to the marketplace. I'd love to have you describe how we can use some of the information in the playbook to support that.
Thanks, Jen. So hi, everyone. I'm Chris Benko. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Koneksa. We're a company that develops and implements digital biomarkers specifically for supporting the development of new medicines by the pharmaceutical industry. So that means that we validate these tools to actually detect the treatment effect of an experimental therapy. I've worked in drug development for 25 years, and I know that the way we measure outcomes is an absolutely critical component. And doing it better is something that can enable a lot more speed and decision-making that can accelerate getting medicines to the people that need them. I've also seen that digital tools allow us to create measures that can be far more meaningful to patients and how we track their symptoms, as well as make it easier and more convenient for them to participate in clinical studies. I've been really excited to be a part of this initiative because it brings together diverse perspectives from various areas of healthcare to find where we have common ground. But also we've been able to work very rapidly to develop what I think is a very substantial deliverable in a way that I've never been able to see with larger consortium, as well intended as they may be. So it's been really exciting to see how quickly this group has pulled these things together. I want to speak a little bit about the operational issues, because that's really where I'm excited to use the playbook in collaboration with our customers in pharma, because we have to work hand in hand with study teams to figure out how new digital measures are going to be implemented. And one of the things we always look at is that, as interesting as a technology may be or an analytics plan, if we don't actually get the data from patients in a compliant fashion, we won't have a successful clinical trial. So that means thinking about technology and its application is something that goes hand in hand. For instance, we might have a technology that's cleared as a medical device by the FDA in the United States. So it's designed for a particular context of use, perhaps for collecting data in care management. But if we want to take that device and deploy it in a global clinical trial, we might quickly find that we don't have the right clearance to go into even Canada, much less Europe, and perhaps that device isn't even logistically available in Asia. So thinking through those kinds of issues, what is the appropriate regulatory clearance, the context of use, and the geography is very important to selecting a technology. It's also important to note that a lot of these hardware technologies, for instance, come with their own proprietary software packages. So we try to put ourselves in the shoes of, for example, the nurses who are at the front line of both care management and clinical trials. And they're going in and out of different electronic medical record systems and clinical trial databases every day. And of course, also the patients who are going to be participating in supplying data. We don't want to load them up with 3 different new applications that they have to work with just because they're using technology in a clinical trial. So it's critical to understand, do those tools have, do those devices have application programming interfaces or software development kits that we can use to integrate their data into a common system that makes it easier for the users to actually collect that data and also does it in a way that's secure and compliant with all the regulations that would be associated with whatever your use case is. So I'm excited that the playbook contains a great deal of detail on how to think through all of these processes and do it in a very compliant way that allows our applications to be successful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. And thanks for all of your support in putting those sections of the playbook together. Dina, I'm going to come across to you. We have a really important section of the playbook on ethics that needs to be front and mind as we deploy these new technologies and as we sort of assess and measure and monitor health in new ways. I wonder if you could introduce yourself to everyone on the line and talk a little bit about the ethical section.
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks, Jen. Hi, I'm Dina Mendelsohn, Director of Health Policy and Data Governance at Elektra Labs, and I'm one of the working group members of the playbook. I'm particularly excited about the ethics section of the playbook, and I look forward to teaching it in practice. One of the important messages that I'm hoping is received is that technology must be worthy of trust. It's my firm belief that technology, which is worthy of trust, will receive more engagement. And with that, we'll experience improvements in care and health outcomes. For many, though, technology may be more problematic than promising. The lack of trust can impact recruitment for trials or adoption by patients. And this is particularly troubling for those who may be turned away. The ethics section of the playbook addresses ethical concerns around the impact of technology in healthcare. In particular, it addresses individuals' access to both primary technology itself, as well as secondary but equally important technology considerations such as broadband access. The playbook also explores ethical issues, including algorithmic bias, tech literacy, and pay for privacy. And finally, the playbook helps teams consider potential harms such as medical, psychological, dignity, and economic harms. Connected sensors offer great promise for clinicians, researchers, and in public health. And ensuring equality and justice in development and deployment of digital clinical measures does not happen by accident. It requires awareness of the risks and intentionality in decision-making. The playbook, I believe, will inform users how to proactively incorporate ethics by design into planning at the forefront so that we can reap the benefits and avoid potential pitfalls. I'm very excited about the ethics section, and I hope people enjoy reading it and get something out of it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dina, and thanks for your leadership there. I think you said it really nicely. We want to make sure we get the full benefit out of all of these technologies using sort of the full scope of what they can offer, but also making sure at every step we're minimizing harm. Such an important part of the work we've done here.
Exactly. Thank you so much for making the space for it.
Of course. Victor, I'm going to come across to you. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to everyone on the line. Talk a little bit about the parts of the playbook that are most important and motivating to you, and how you plan to use them with your teams at Genentech.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm Victor Chan. I lead digital health strategy for Genentech's personalized healthcare group. And I focus on oncology drug development, but this is something that we do across all, all therapeutic areas. I do want to take a moment just to recognize my Genentech research and early development colleague, Tom Switzer, who couldn't be here today, but was absolutely instrumental in, in providing input on this playbook. So at Genentech, I actually work with our molecule teams to brainstorm ways to incorporate digital measurement into their clinical development plans. And this playbook, and in particular, let's say this slide, will really help me work with those teams to develop measures that matter to patients. So we'll start by identifying a meaningful aspect of health. What is it about a patient's disease that matters to them? What don't we want, what don't they want to get worse? Or what do they want to improve or prevent? From there, we'll narrow that element into concepts of interest and eventually clinical measures. Jen, if you could switch to the next slide. And so throughout this playbook, we've included a number of examples. So here, let's say we're developing a drug for Parkinson's disease, and we'd like to incorporate a digital measurement into a clinical trial. We start by getting feedback from patients about how their disease is impacting their lives. So we hear from them, I want to be able to walk so I can carry my own groceries. And so from there, we focus on the concept of interest, something that we can measure. What is it about that statement that we hear from patients? Something that we can measure, like activity or walking capacity. And finally, we arrive at an endpoint that can be analyzed in our clinical trial. For instance, percentage of patients with a certain increase in activity compared to baseline. And similarly, we show how patients with anxiety disorder or complain about exhaustion and not being able to rest and relax. And from this, we can drill down to sleep and sleep duration to arrive at the endpoint, average change in time to sleep onset 1 month from baseline. And it's only through this sort of stepwise approach that we've developed in this playbook that we can measure, that we can develop measurements that actually matter to patients. And only by starting with what matters to patients do we avoid the trap that was discussed before of measuring whatever the technology allows us to. After all, this isn't really about our technology, it's about our patients. And we shouldn't measure something just because we can. We have to be thoughtful about what we put our patients through. Yeah, thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for guiding us through how you plan to use this with your teams, but also sort of showcasing one of the things that's at the core of the playbook. We try oftentimes to take these sort of complex sort of principles and give them an example form, really try and serve it up so it's easy for everyone on the line to go away and implement this with their teams. While we're on the topic of examples, Steve, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to everyone and also talk a little bit about how you plan to use the playbook and how it could be valuable in care settings such as your own.
Thanks, Jen. I'm Steve Steinhubel. I'm a cardiologist and I'm a clinical researcher. And I was fortunate enough about 7 years ago to start helping build our digital medicine group at Scripps Research, and given me the opportunity to work with great people like Katie, who you've heard from, and Ed Ramos, who you'll hear from next. As both a clinician and a researcher, I've been passionate about remote monitoring for a long time because it's really transformational, and I know it's a term we use too often, but it really gives us, for the very first time in healthcare and healthcare research, where we can move beyond population-based care or population-based research and really individualize our care and research endpoints. And what I mean by this is it really lets us, for the first time, compare you to you. So you when you're healthy, or you when you're not feeling well, to later when you're healthy, as opposed to a population normal. And a great example of this is Katie had mentioned the study we're doing in COVID of just looking at resting heart rate. So as a cardiologist or any of your doctors, if you go into the doctor's office, you go into a research study and your heart rate is anywhere between 60 and 100, that's just normal, because on a population base, that's normal. But we know from through other research programs and looking at wearable data that everybody on this call has a resting heart rate that's pretty unique to them, that actually varies very little from day to day or week to week, maybe 3 beats. But it's also very different between all of us. So somebody's resting heart rate may be 48, somebody else's resting heart rate may be 98. Those are both completely normal for you. But routinely in research and in healthcare, we don't know that information. And so that's what this remote monitoring and digital technology really allows us to do. And the Playbook I look at is this invaluable resource that if we're, as a researcher or clinician, we're standing at a workbench and we want to do something, take advantage of digital technologies, whether it's in research or in care, that the Playbook is kind of the pegboard of tools with instructions in front of us. And it gives us all the information and things that we need to implement these tools and take advantage of them to create solutions in either research or care. But what I'm equally passionate about is the fact that too often using these tools, we've been unsuccessful. And I think that's often because we're only thinking of taking advantage of these as a way to replace paper-based either care or research or analog-based care or research with the digital technology. And I think we fall short. So we're trying to get these tools and fit them in the existing systems of care or existing research systems. And what is really important to me and what a lot of our work at Scripps is focused on is how do we build new systems of research? How do we build new systems of care that really take full advantage of all of the great technologies that are listed here in the Playbook and will be that will be addressed in future tours of duty. So it's been an honor to be part of this and excited to see it grow over the years.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. And I mean, you and I are similar in as much as I do think the word sort of transformational is overused, but I think in this case, it's really important. And something folks will see in the care section in particular, but throughout, is that we're not trying to take these tools and sort of shoehorn them into something else. We really are thinking about how can we rethink how we serve patients, how we deliver care, how we do research, now armed with the power of these tools. So I'm really glad you teased that out. And I want to take a hot second and just thank all of our colleagues who throughout the Playbook graciously allowed us to use their photos to give a sort of a personal touch to the examples. It took a little bit of goat wrestling, just so everyone on the line knows, but we have great teammates and I'm grateful to all of you. And with that, Ed, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to everyone. You, like Steve and Priyanka, were very generous with the use of your image and examples. So please introduce yourself to the gang and tell us about how you plan to apply the Playbook.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So I'm Ed Ramos, and on the heels of Katie and Steve, really they set the stage beautifully for what the Digital Trial Center is meant to be within Scripps Research and in partnership with Carevolution. And so my position actually sits with a foot in each of those institutions, serving as part of the team on the digital clinical trial side within Scripps, and also serving as the principal science officer at Carevolution, who is not only just supplying the technology, but really a partner in thought and in execution in terms of how we develop and deploy all of these studies. So excited at this new venture and new effort between two great powerhouses. So for me, the Playbook honestly is just so aptly named. I'll spare everyone my poor sports metaphors, but it really gives you an opportunity to think about your context in terms of, well, what is it that I need to turn to in terms of a plan as I look to identify a roadmap towards a potential solution or for better understanding health outcomes and so on. And so the availability of use cases within the playbook, I think, is extraordinary, because there's so much substantive information that is important and needs to be conveyed, but putting that into actual examples and illustrating it with some specifics, I think, is really the added touch that is needed, so folks can really start to contextualize the information more specifically. So for me, we touched on one of the studies that we're focused on that really tries to give an example of how we leverage this in the public health space, with diabetes being a huge public health issue, recognizing that it isn't just a genetic disorder, for example, and there's so many environmental influences. And how do we get at leveraging digital health measures to have a broader understanding of all those potential influences and risk factors that may lead to a disease outcome. And the next slide is really just how we think about potentially layering all of these different health measures. And so the progress effort, which is a focus from the new Digital Trial Center, which is looking at potential prediction of glycemic response in individuals with and without type 2 diabetes. And you can think of all sorts of ways to go about doing this. And we're leveraging everything from platforms that have a number of different off-the-shelf functionality, commercially available products, as well as medical devices that outside of a research context would require a prescription, and layering all this information to really have that comprehensive picture at an individual level, and potentially be able to speak to a population level as well. So excited that we're putting this into practice already for so many things that we have done and will do, and excited at the evolution of the playbook. So I'm happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ed. And I'm going to kill the share for just a second. We'll have a couple of questions with this second panel before we talk about what's next, and then throw it open to audience Q&A. So what really shines through from all of the topics that you guys touched on is the importance of sort of intentionality around approach, starting with the measure and sort of de facto starting with the patient, through the technology, through the ops. Thinking about all sorts of humans who are involved in this, most importantly the patient, and getting that right. But Chris, you also talked about other critical sort of stakeholders here. There's all the clinical teams that have to sort of handle these technologies and deploy them. There's the technical teams that support the data coming in and managing them out in the world. I think about the importance of engaging, and Dina, actually, I need to touch on the ethical piece too, right? It's not just that the measures matter, but that we're making sure that we don't inadvertently cause harm. But we haven't been particularly good always at asking folks and engaging folks, even before we got to digital. I'm always sort of kept in mind of the 6-minute walk test, right? The gold standard test in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy that sort of systematically excludes from measurement. Unfortunately, the majority of those boys and young men who are already wheelchair bound. So we haven't done it well before, but we have an opportunity as we launch into this digital era. Curious to hear from you guys how we can get it better this time around. And Victor, I know you've been thinking about this with some of your team, so I wonder if we can start with you.
Wow, sure. So I guess one of the things that I've learned through this process is that these things take time. And there are lots of people that are involved, both internally and externally. and we really need to, plan for that. So it's not like you can develop the protocol and then say, hey, let's throw in a digital piece. I think that is not ideal. Maybe one of the other things that I would also personally like to highlight is we, really strive to work with patients directly. And so we have a patient partnerships group. But I think one of the things within digital that we should also be really, cognizant of is, as we're getting input from patients, that we really get input from a representative selection of patients, so that we understand sort of how different patient subgroups might respond to that specific technology. We may find that certain patients can't tolerate certain types of wearables, and I think that we need to really understand that deeply, and that all really takes time.
Fantastic. I think that's really important, Victor, making sure we allow the time to do this really well in advance. I want to think about how you do this at perhaps not an individual level, but at a population or a community level, when you're thinking more on the public health side? How do we do this to make sure that we don't suddenly go from the individual level all the way up to the sort of the full macro level without thinking about differences among communities and individual groups? What's been successful for you?
Yeah, so I mean, this is where the broadening participation really comes into play, and really having an understanding of the individuals that you want to bring into a particular study. And this is where I think digital health technologies can really facilitate, because it allows for a paradigm shift of bringing the study outside of a brick and mortar clinic, and really being able to really embrace that remote, sightless kind of underlying theme of a digital trial. Importantly, however, it doesn't mean that you can't build the same robust partnership with a participant that's based on trust. Digital doesn't mean that they never see or speak to an individual. We can leverage things like Zoom conferences and telephone calls and still have that personal touch when needed and when appropriate. But it does mean that we have an opportunity to bring in more communities, give participants that wouldn't necessarily have access the ability to participate. And that really then allows for moving away from homogeneous observations, where just because I studied this particular set of individuals, I can now apply that to the entire population, especially within the United States, because we have so many different representations, not just in race and ethnicity, but there's so many categories and variables that need to be understood, from socioeconomic status to geographic location and so on. So really that breadth and depth of participant representation is a beautiful thing to be able to address with this type of approach.
Fantastic, thanks, Ed. And I like how you teased out the possibility of actually using the technologies as part of the engagement and not separate from. In Christine's paper that was published today, she actually has some lovely examples around that, so I encourage you all to take a look. I'm going to pose one last question, and I'm going to see, Chris, if you can jump in on it first, and then maybe Steve. We also need to think about both the patients and the populations we all exist to serve, but as we said, those other users of the technology. Chris, you know, DIME is based on the premise of bringing the sort of the clinical and the tech world together. How have you had success doing that previously, of being able to think about the data scientist and everyone who has their hands on the technology in addition to these critical patient considerations?
Yeah, I've heard someone else use the expression, you know, you want to, you know, take off with the same crew that you're going to use to land the airplane. And that means that, you know, the folks that are involved with thinking about how to analyze the data at the end should be talking with the people up front who are designing the clinical study and measures. And then, of course, always lining that up with the input of the patients and the frontline care workers that are involved in the process. It truly has to be a collaboration across each of those areas. I think, you know, leaving any one of them out is a major limitation. I think Victor said it well. Having the frontline patient input is absolutely critical, but that also needs to be married up with some other disciplines that aren't always around the table. And I would say specifically looking at some of the complex analytics and data science work that has to be done, that's probably one of the areas that's least familiar, at least in the drug development space, maybe in other areas of healthcare where those groups haven't necessarily had a voice. But when you put them in front of the other users and include them in those discussions, I think you make better decisions and you see much better outcomes that are easier for everybody to operationalize.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. And I'm going to pose a similar question to you, Steve. You know, rightly so, nothing really gets deployed in clinical care unless we have the buy-in of our physician colleagues, our nursing colleagues, so on and so forth. How can we get better in hearing their voices while also being cognizant that we are trying to be transformational here?
Yeah, so I think first let me reinforce what Chris said. And I think if we think about this as building new systems of care, new systems of research, you have to have everybody who's part of that system involved and in a meaningful way. And the other aspect of that is you have to go into it in a very different way than we routinely do, which is this very linear approach. We'll write a protocol and then a year from now we'll see if we were successful. But really looking at it from a complexity standpoint of realizing a lot of things aren't going to work the way they need to, so you have to learn as you do that. One of the things I've seen that almost never works is often these tools are designed, whether it's in care or in research, where everything funnels down to the healthcare provider, to the clinician, and just says, and they'll look at it. And one of our former colleagues at Scripps Health, who ran ambulatory care, always used to say, remember, my clinicians don't have a spare second during the day. And I think that's really true. That just the idea, if we say, oh, it'll just take them 30 seconds to look at it, that doesn't work. And so I think when we're creating anything, whether it's in a new system, whether it's clinical or in research, you have to make it easy for the healthcare provider who's on the receiving end, who has to make the decisions. You have to create part of that solution has to be something that is time saving for the person on the receiving end. And if you do that, it'll be wildly embraced.
Fantastic. I think that's really important, and as a sort of general value to help us get everyone aligned as we move forward, is there has to be, rightly so, something in it for everyone. We have to be able to give folks an incentive to make this transformation from patients all the way through to sort of the end users. I'm going to transition across to how everyone on the line can get involved. But Christine, I again want to highlight your terrific paper that you worked on with Braid Patrick Lake from Evidation Health, and invited me to tag along on. Again, this covers, that terrific paper led by Christine covers a lot of this. Also, the tremendous ethics section that Dina championed. And we also have John Wilbanks from Sage Bionetworks on the line, who is such a thoughtful expert in all of these things. It's not just about sort of how to address folks, but what I really like about the ethics section is how the playbook highlights sort of new questions we need to be asking too as we move into this digital era of health. So with that, let me reshare my screen for a hot second before I hand off to Andy to moderate some audience questions. Can you see my slides, guys? Fantastic. So now this is where hopefully we've made everyone who took the time to join us this morning, and we are grateful for all of you, excited about the promise of digital clinical measures, that we have convinced you that there is the ability to sort of develop and deploy these things across settings, and that we can work together to do that efficiently and with patients at the center. And now we would like to sort of invite all of you to sort of dive in with us and continue to create, and Gina, I'm going to use your words, this public good. Steve, you also had some lovely language around this being sort of the playbook being the pegboard of tools and resources that anyone can draw from. How do we ensure that it remains up to the minute and that every tool on that pegboard is truly useful and that we haven't missed anything? So I think the most important thing to say is we have a draft of the playbook. It is available for you today. I think it probably went live about 3 minutes ago. If you go to playbook.dimesociety.org, it is there for your download and for you to use with your teams. We would also like to warmly invite you to join us on this next tour of duty. All of my colleagues that you've met this morning participated in this tour of duty to launch the playbook. We think of them as sprints. This work is important. It cannot wait. For a period of about 4 to 6 months, we really dig in. We try and uphold DIME's values of clinical quality evidence on a tech timeline. We want to do great work, but we realize there's an appetite for it today. And as we embark on the next sprint to really refine the playbook, to optimize it for all of you who need access to this information, who need access to those tools on the pegboard, please join us. And there's a link in these slides and also at playbook.dimesociety.org where you can sign up to dive in on the next round. To let you know what that timeline looks like, we are going to welcome applications from folks who want to dive in with us for the next month. We then plan to dive in a true sprint. We recognize there are some holidays in there. We want to be respectful of that, but our goal is, excuse me, to launch an updated version as part of this public good in April of next year. And I think the more we can get a varied, diverse and representative sort of view of the whole ecosystem to dive in with us and to refine it, we will get even greater value out of what my colleagues developed in this tremendous resource that we launched today. So the other thing I wanted to make you all aware of, and that you will all see when you go and download the playbook shortly, this isn't easy. It is very possible. There are methods to do it. When we collaborate, we will get it right and we will better serve our patients. But there's a lot here. I think Andy shared that there are about 400 slides in the playbook. We certainly don't intend you to sit down and read this with a cup of coffee or a pot of coffee, as it might require this afternoon. And to really help introduce you to all of this content, through the course of the fall, we are hosting a Playbook Masterclass series. So all of my colleagues on the line will serve as instructors. We have a curriculum. We have a 1-hour session every Tuesday afternoon starting at the end of this month, where you can get exposed to certain sections of the playbook that might be most relevant to you and have some one-on-one live time in a smaller setting with experts on those particular tasks. Again, all of that information and the ability to sign up for a variety of different sessions or just one session in the Playbook Masterclass is available at playbook.dimesociety.org. And with that, Andy, let me stop sharing my screen. You've done a brilliant job of moderating questions, and let's throw a few questions from the audience to our colleagues.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I think you saw me typing, and a bunch of other of us have been answering a lot of your questions through here. We know that we will not get to all of them right now. What we're going to do is we'll send you the recording afterwards. You'll get the playbook, and then I have to check with Jen. We might be able to send some of these Q&A and more. We think this is an ongoing dialogue. Something that is important as you think about this, when you download the playbook, we very intentionally licensed it under Creative Commons. And what that means is that we want you, and there are different types of Creative Commons licenses. We licensed it under a shared version where you can share even if you're using it in a commercial version. And we also allow you to adapt. We expect you to adapt. We think that what we've built is a first version that will need to change and evolve with the times. We have required attribution if you use the playbook, and there is a way that you can attribute back the resources, but we want you to use it, and we want you to use it in practice. So what I'm going to do is pull some of these open questions that people have had, and also some of the answered ones. My answers might not have been the best answers. Sorry if you got some of them. One of the questions that came up quite a lot is, not only can we use these tools, but should we? And in what instances, and what are the ethical considerations, and how do we think about that? So Laura, your team and the team at Sage and John have been thinking a lot. And one thing I learned a lot from you is why we don't use the term privacy per se, because in some instances you might actually want to share. And that's one of the issues with healthcare. So how do you think about data rights? What are some of the tools and practices? Sage has been one of the leaders in creating resources that aren't just theoretical, like the paper that came out yesterday. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the resources, both at Sage and broadly, as people think about answering these questions?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question, and it's something we're all grappling with. At Sage, we've taken the approach of involving patients and individuals who might be involved in the research studies we're running at the front to understand what the range of shared expectations are around data rights and their understanding, right, of what it is they're signing up for. And so we've created a series of tools that you know, sort of based on that, allows us to build initially enrollment and consenting processes that allow people to make a range of choices around what feels right for them. But increasingly, we're recognizing that that's just, it's not enough just at the beginning of the study. You need to be going back to this throughout the study, because people change, their views change, their experiences change, and their interests might change. So we've created a series of tools around that. We have a consent toolkit and a privacy toolkit that you can get to through our website, which is sagebionetworks.org, that are meant sort of similarly as this playbook to be guidelines for anyone in the field who is thinking through these questions, giving them both resources and questions they might ask themselves as they're trying to decide the answer to this question within the context of their study.
Great. And a thing I love about Sage is it's very practical. So if your engineer is like, how do I build informed consent? What do I need to do? They literally even have Figma templates for some of them for you to pull from. So it's quite great. Again, this is an ongoing dialogue. We're not going to answer all of these today. Many people have Twitter, so feel free to reach out to people directly and we'll follow up. I guess the last one that came up quite a lot, Gina, is people seem to be kind of nervous about the FDA and figuring out like, what does the FDA think? And you know, what is the stance and how can they get involved? And so maybe can you talk a little bit about how anyone can get involved in the FDA, ways that you might communicate with the agency, and how people might want to interact with regulators as this field gets developed over time?
Sure. I think just to touch on it quickly, and certainly want to clarify that there aren't, you know, official positions here being shared.
Exactly.
These are really, this is about weighing in on you know, innovation and what might be useful and helpful, and we're in early stages of figuring these things out together. You know, I will say, I think some of the most effective ways that I've seen on my side of the FDA, on this side of these interactions, have been through public-private partnerships, as well as through the public commenting process. I know those things are taken very seriously and read in depth, and really, you know, when those comments are solicited, they are very much appreciated and looked at and considered. And then certainly, I think Chris mentioned as well the Technology Modernization Action Plan, which is, I think, just had a birthday. I think really shares some of the modern thinking that is coming out of FDA around what we think we need to change in order to adapt to a changing environment. And I think an acknowledgement that there is a lot of work to do to figure out how to really make the best use of technology and devices and wearables, and all of these things kind of fit into that of, you know, we're trying to figure that along with you, what the best, you know, the best approach is to really utilizing these tools to improve public health, and that's the ultimate aim and goal. And so I think getting involved in some of these projects and initiatives, particularly through these public-private partnerships, we would love to have you. We would love for you to be part of our Evidence Accelerator community with, or the Reagan-Udall Foundation's Evidence Accelerator community along with us, and engage with us in conversation there. It's a really, it's a hard time, but it's a really exciting time, and we certainly welcome participation and engagement.
So put another way, the regulators are not responsible for reading your tweets, but they are responsible for reading your public comments. So please comment on public documents. And I think one of the things that comes up is there's a lot of unknowns right now, right? Where we built this guide to stitch together other different groups, and you can be part of this solution and figure out how to bring these tools safely and effectively. Maybe it's through the playbook, maybe it's through being in part of public comment, maybe it's in the day-to-day work that you're doing. But this is one of those, and maybe it's cheesy, but like, this is literally a time where we build the future, right? And I think it's really important to make sure that we build an intentional future and not one where things just move too quickly and we adopt things that we're not really thoughtful of. Everything here and the foundation of healthcare is making sure that things are worthy of trust. And so let's make sure that we build a future that we're really proud of. All right, thank you. Jen?
Fantastic. So I have but one last slide to share, and Andy, you selected terrific questions from our audience. I think that, you know, the importance of, you know, thinking about data privacy in this era not being enough. Dina, you define that beautifully in the playbook. The terrific SAGE resources are all referenced there in the playbook, and there's also a section on public comment. So Gina, hopefully this will inspire a few more people to dive in. So very quickly to close, and before I thank my colleagues on the line, thank you everyone who dialed in today. We are so proud of the playbook. It is now available for you to download, for you to start using with your teams, and really importantly, for you to start engaging with and improving with us. So we want your feedback. We don't want this to be something that's static. It is a public good, and it's something we want your help to continue to move forward and continue to make the biggest difference to the field. And so with that, I want to make sure that we finish up on time. And the last thing I will do is just thank all of my colleagues on the playbook. Andy, co-leading with this project with you has been an absolute pleasure. You have such tremendous vision, and it was a really, really terrific output from this. I want to thank Gina, Priyanka, Lara, Katie, Christine, Chris, Dina, Victor, And Victor, I'm glad you gave Tom a shout out today. I'm sad he's not here, but he was such an important part of all this. And I'm sure he'll be continuing to push this forward with us. Also Steve and Ed and John, really, really grateful for all of you guys. Hopefully what we've built together will be a valuable resource for the field. We look forward to everyone's comments, and thanks everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jen.
Bye-bye.